So a lot of things to talk about. So what we do at IDC is we look at Canadian organizations who are more successful and compare them to those who are a little bit less successful, and then try and determine, well, why is that the case? Right? Why are some organizations doing really well? Right? So from a public sector standpoint, right? Delivering higher quality of service, or better citizen satisfaction with given services, or whatever that might look like. And the different KPIs that we use to do that. From a private sector standpoint, it's being able to determine higher revenue growth, again, things like user satisfaction, and a range of different KPIs that we use to determine what is a successful organization, and what are they doing from an IT standpoint to be more successful. And then, so what I want to do is share with you what's happening across the country and what organizations are doing to differentiate themselves. Because we're in a period of incredible change, as you know, and I think the speed of change has really increased. So there's a lot to learn. I mean, you were learning more than you know about what Red Hat is doing from a DevOps standpoint, from a cloud standpoint, and some of what's going on in the industry. So what I also want to share with you is specifically what your peers across Canada are thinking and doing. And again, just give you that level set for where they're at along the way. So with that, let's go ahead. And so at the highest of levels, when we're thinking about digital transformation and thinking about organizations moving forward and doing things differently, there's two major areas, right? One is just looking internally, looking at employees and looking at the workflow that employees go through, whether it's the front line of retail or a healthcare practitioner or in education or whatever that might look like. And so doing things better, but then being able to do things fundamentally differently than they were able to do things before. And then from a customer standpoint, it's the same thing. It's wanting to build out a basic mobile app or do some basic analytics or things that can help, or chatbots or whatever, things that can help customers do things better and engage government more easily and engage it more often in more meaningful ways. And similarly within the private sector as well, customers engaging the organization. And so we want to do that better and then be able to do things fundamentally different than we've done them before. And that's what the technology is allowing organizations to do. And that's what leading organizations around the world are doing, right? And so when we think about, just at the starting point, what we find is just from a mobile app perspective, we've got about half of Canadian organizations who have started and said, you know what, I'm going to try and launch a mobile app for my customers. So lots of activity happening there. And there's a lot of things in behind that need to happen to make that successful. We'll talk about that. And then from an employee standpoint, we've got more organizations who really started there and said, look, I'm going to look internally first. I'm going to look at finance, at HR. I'm going to look at marketing, or I'm going to look at service delivery, or whatever that might look like. And I'm going to look at those aspects of my organization and say, okay, how can I apply this very basic technology? But it's about things like mobile. It's also about combining that with other things, right? Whether it's adding in an IoT component, whether it's starting to add in a blockchain component, whether it's starting to add in. And so I want to talk about the combination of those different technologies and what that means. But you think of, a great couple of examples from Canada. So Landar's from Montreal. Landar is this company, and they're shaking up the music industry. So what they do is there's this process in music. If you listen to Spotify or you listen to iTunes or just, turn on your radio, the songs that you hear will have this nice glossy finish to them, right? So there's this process in music called mastering, and there's little bits before that get done. What these folk are doing is they're essentially automating that process, right? So they've said, look, we can use machine learning to listen to the songs at the top of the chart, so that if any of us record a song right now, they'll make it sound a little bit more like Sia or whatever it is, right? So they'll enhance that song, make it sound much better than any of us could possibly record right now. And so what they've done is taken something that's thousands of dollars for an average band to be able to have access to and made it $5, right? So you can just go to their website and get your song mastered for $5. So what they've done from an employee standpoint is said, look, my traditional engineer that would go out and listen to each song and adjust each little individual frequency within the song, I said, okay, well, no, we can do this differently. Now what the mastering engineers do is they help the data scientists train the models, right? And so that's their role, so they still have jobs, but their job function is vastly different than it was. And instead of mastering, maybe hundreds of songs or what have you, they're mastering literally millions, right? This company's done over 1 million songs now that they've mastered. And so out of Montreal, and so that's from an employee standpoint. From a customer standpoint, they're fundamentally changing the industry insofar as now any band who otherwise would never have been able to buy this service can actually buy this kind of service, can make their songs sound a little better than otherwise they would have been able to do. So that's doing things very differently than have been done before. But we can start with something that's far more straightforward. And you think about Touch Bistro, they're out of Toronto, or Shopify, also out of the different offices throughout Canada, but primarily in Ontario. And what they're starting to do is say, look, we can drop point-of-sale terminals in place of or in addition to waitstaff within restaurants, or say an airport, right? You're going through the airport, all you want to do is get to your plane, maybe you want a club sandwich before you get to the plane. And so I want to be able to not have the friction of waiting for the waitstaff to come and take the order, of waiting for them to then pay the bill or whatever that might look like. So I want to be able to expedite that. So for me as a customer standpoint, it's great. I just go to the iPad, I punch in what the order is, and then I pay for that. That's great. Frictionless service. But what's happening is, so it's really something simple. They just do something a little bit better than we've done it before. But based on doing that thing that's just a little bit better, now what companies like Touch Bistro and Shopify and others are doing, they're saying, wow, look at all this data that we have. I can see all the transactions that this restaurant is doing. And because I can see all these transactions they're doing, I know if I maybe want to give them a loan. Right? The bank may say, no, I'm sorry, I can't give you a loan. We don't like to loan to restaurants or to other retailers, what have you. These guys can see the actual transactions that are happening and becoming more like fintech type companies. So again, it's starting to do things a little bit better and from simple examples, and then starting to build up from there and do things fundamentally differently than I think we've been able to do them in the past. So it's good that Canadian organizations are saying, look, I get that. I get that I can do things differently from an employee or from a customer standpoint. But there's not a lot of urgency, right? Even though, I look in Toronto and, we've got 450,000 room nights were booked through Airbnb last year. That's 450,000 room nights on Airbnb last year. And, you think of all the other changes that are happening, whether it's hospitality or retail, the changes from Sears and Toys R Us and others. I mean, there's no shortage of industries where we're seeing fundamental changes happening. Okay, so when we ask them, okay, well, why from a line of business, from an IT standpoint, isn't the urgency there? And why are you not kind of moving fast enough? Well, number one is organizations will say, I don't have the money. The budget's just not there. Then similarly, they'll say, well, I don't really have the time. I've got all these other projects to do. I'm kind of busy. How do you expect me to rack and stack servers and patch and update and do all the other stuff I have to do and do these additional things? How do you expect me to do that? On the line of business side, what they'll also say is they'll say, well, it's going to be a challenge for us to modify our legacy processes, right? There's a lot of things that we've been doing as an organization for years. How do we just change that? And then from an IT standpoint, they'll say, well, we're not really getting the leadership from the line of business side of the organization to do things differently, to say, hey, we're going to give you the budget and the time to actually do this differently. So I want to talk about some of these areas and some ideas to think through this. But when we think about where Canadian organizations are at and the path that we need to take, so you heard about things like DevOps and moving into more of a microservice-based architecture and starting to use things like platform as a service. And those are all fundamental things to moving towards a digital organization. Yes, using things like cloud and starting to build out mobile applications and that kind of thing are important as well. But it's about being able to figure out where our organization is at today from being a traditionalist and then trying to move to being an experimentalist, just trying out using some of the tools, whether it's the basic tools like Git or Jenkins or Chef or Puppet or Ansible or what have you, and then starting to think about how we do things differently from a cultural standpoint. And I want to talk about that as well because it's one of the key elements to this. Yes, it's using the tools, and yes, it's thinking about our processes, but it's also about how as a culture we're going to be able to do things differently than we have before. And then we want to start to embed those experiments that we've done into being more of these operationalists. So that throughout the organization, we're embedding that, the learning that we've made, and we're embedding that within, again, HR or finance or in service delivery, in sales, marketing, whatever different aspect of the business that might be. And then finally, Strategists are the organizations which are really hard to find in Canada, but it's those who are not just embedding this culture and the technologies and the training that they've done with their people, but they're actually going forward and really doing things fundamentally different than they've done it before. What we find is that when we ask Canadian organizations, well, where are you at today along the continuum of your culture, of using machine learning, of training your staff, typically what they'll say is, well, I'm either an experimentalist or I'm an operationalist. So we go in and measure it, and they're really traditionalists. So organizations believe they're much farther ahead than they are, and I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have the urgency. We think we're actually already doing a really good job. The problem is that we're actually a little bit farther behind, I think, and we just need to look throughout our industries and see some of the glowing examples that are out there and some of the radical change that's already occurring. So I think if I was to net it out, it's more like this. It's more this 80-20 rule where we've got about 80% of Canadian organizations who are kind of at that starting point. They're traditionalists, doing things in a traditional fashion, or maybe just starting to experiment and try things in a different way. And it's easy to become an experimentalist. There's no real challenge there other than starting to identify people within the organization who can help to do things a little bit differently. The challenge comes from crossing that digital divide and becoming this operationalist, right? To start to really embed the culture of DevOps, and even if you don't do development, right? Because we were talking about DevOps earlier, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but the same processes and the same values that come out of being able to abstract administration from the underlying hardware benefits admins or benefits others in the organization as well. But anyway, so we want to be able to cross that digital divide. Not necessarily the easiest thing to do, so I want to talk about ways that we can start to cross that digital divide, making our way from being an experimentalist all the way to being this operationalist. At the most simplistic level, these organizations on the right-hand side of that chart, those who are those who are operationalists or strategists, are focused on data, getting the most out of that, analytics, but they view it as critical to their organization's success and the value of their organization. Cloud, in particular, platform as a service. And platform as a service in Canada, whether it's on-prem or whether it's in Azure, AWS, Bluemix, you name it, Salesforce, a range of different options there, is really to be looking at that. It's going to be a key differentiator for our country and for our organizations in particular, and I'll talk about why that's the case. But and also the relationship with their vendors is very different. So they look to Red Hat or whoever their vendors are, and they say, okay, I know that this organization has learned from the toughest of problems already in Canada, and I'm going to learn from them and get that knowledge transfer. So we find that that's another differentiator. So there's three things that IT needs to do, right? Number one is help the business identify which aspect of the organization they're going to be able to transform, or at least to do things better and then to transform. And then identify the technologies, and then go ahead and project manage all that. So a lot more to add to the plate. We have to figure out ways that we can claw back time somewhere else in order to be able to start to do things a little bit differently than we've done them before. So in the first place, what we see is that we ask organizations about automation within the organization, within the IT department in particular, and just basic things like patching and updating and being able to do basic security config and that kind of thing. And what we find is that about 7 out of 10 organizations will say, well, not really there. I'm still doing things in the traditional way that I've done them. I'm just kind of starting down that path of doing things differently. And yet, when we go in and we measure organizations who have started to use tools like OpenShift and Ansible and the other tools that you're going to be hearing about, there's a radical difference between one organization versus the other in terms of, and actually I can show you here what that kind of looks like. We've got the investment. It's not just the tools. It's also, by the way, the processes. Things like change management, portfolio management are key processes to be investing in. But the advantage is that organizations' deployment time of applications significantly faster. From a private sector standpoint, significant higher revenue growth attributed to that. And it's because the IT department is able to move more quickly and do different sort of projects and actually helping to lead the organization in doing things differently than they've done it before. And from a public sector standpoint, again, it's being able to offer more services to a citizen base, but also be able to expand the reach of those services and accessibility of those services as well. right? So we've, again, just been measuring successful Canadian organizations and seeing the difference between those who take a very simple approach of just starting to invest in the tools and some very basic processes that I'll continue to talk about. Okay, so when we look at our Canadian marketplace, and by the way, this is all the spend that you plus everyone from British Columbia to PEI are spending on technology in Canada and what that looks like over the next few years. And you can see that the on-premise piece is slowly starting to decrease, but it's not disappearing anytime soon. We see the third platform, in particular around cloud, is growing significantly. And then we've got areas like IoT and robotics and AR, VR, and a bunch of really interesting blockchain and a bunch of other interesting technologies that are starting to grow in that top, the blue area up at the top. Several interesting things come out of this. So one is just the growth of infrastructure and platform as a service in this country. We've seen, infrastructure as a service alone next year is going to be $1 billion spend here in Canada. Compare that to what we spend on server storage and network throughout all of our data centers. That's a $2 billion spend. So already we'll be at about half of that level of spend in IaaS. Platform as a service, likewise, is growing quite strongly. But what's going to happen is this increasing need to take a hybrid cloud and a hybrid IT type of view, where what happens from the blue area in terms of, say, IoT and the events and the data that gets triggered off of it, an IoT sensor, winds up eventually getting either stored into the cloud or back on-prem. And so we've got this closed loop between the sensor and what's happening on-prem. And even if you're not in using IoT or what have you, what we are seeing is this increasing desire to be able to migrate workloads back and forth, to be able to spin up and spin down workloads far more easily, and do that across a hybrid type of environment. Now, when we ask Canadian organizations, well, what are your top challenges in terms of being able to do this, working within a hybrid type of environment? Number one is security. And what they really mean by security is a couple things. One is shared responsibility. Who has responsibility for what? Another one is confidentiality, right? Being able to maintain the sensitivity and privacy of sensitive data. In particular, as we look at Digital Privacy Act and GDPR becoming more important within this country. Then we look at data residency, really important here in Quebec, but also throughout the rest of the country as organizations want to keep their data as close to them as possible. Self-service, whether that's a developer being able to self-service, a line of business, whether it's an admin, getting more important. An area that's really shifted, though, quite strongly and grown from below the top 5 and strongly into the top 5 is workload portability and identity management. So workload portability is being able to easily move data around, be able to have the right RTO and RPO around that data so that I can be assured that I'm spending the right amount of money on storing that data, on the performance of a given application, and on it goes. So it's being able to move that around. The ability to do that is going to be based on investing in things like containers, investing in tools that will help to orchestrate that around OpenShift and those types of tools that allow for that kind of connectivity between the different environments. And then finally, around identity management, that's really grown strongly within our country as we see organizations say, okay, well, how do I manage credentials across a microservice environment? Or more simplistically, how do I just ensure that I've got federated identity across these different kinds of environments, whether it's in my PaaS environment or whether it's on-prem or what have you. So that's grown up, again, very strongly as an area of focus for organizations. So I want to talk a bit more about those. This I won't have time to go into all the detail, but what he did was drew out a chart that basically just shows shared responsibility and who has responsibility for what across hybrid IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, between the provider, what's their responsibility from a security standpoint, and what's the organization's responsibility. Right? So you take something like incident management, and if you don't have log management turned on in AWS or what have you, their ability to be able to help you investigate that incident obviously is going to be quite limited. So it's just going through that checklist and making sure that those things are dealt with as we start to go into this hybrid type of environment and think about what security is going to look like and how we're going to balance that responsibility between what our organization needs to do and what the cloud provider is going to do. Anyway, I'm not going to go into detail on that and to every one of the details, but I did want to at least provide that to you so you have that available so that when you go back to your own organization, you have that as a bit of a cheat sheet. And definitely something that we need to look at as we're measuring organizations and how fast it takes us and how long it takes us to be able to discover that there's actually attacks on our networks, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's on-prem, right? And we're actually not talking about hours or weeks. We're talking about months when we're measuring the average Canadian organization, right? So a lot that we need to do. So sometimes when we're talking to organizations, we'll say, well, okay, so I just have to throw more budget at the problem. I got to buy bigger firewalls. I've got to buy a SIM solution. I got to buy a next-gen endpoint, and then all is going to be good. Well, when we actually measure what makes a successful organization from a security standpoint, it's really about not necessarily the budget that they're spending or the technology that they're spending. So what this chart is saying is the companies that are on the right-hand side, those are the ones that suffer the least amount of breaches in Canada. And then as you go to the left-hand side, you get more and more and more breaches. Attackers should be going after the organizations on the left-hand side of that chart because they're much easier to exploit. So the ones, the defeatists, which are denialists, which are the second category there, translates to negatists. But in any case, it's these organizations do a really good job from a technology standpoint, and they actually they've got the highest budgets on security here in Canada, and yet from their perspective, they're less secure than organizations than our realists are. And what our realists are doing really a good job at is understanding their attack surface. As they start to expand that attack surface, understanding where the weaknesses are, basically working through risk management processes and probability impact matrix and the very basics of that. And then the egos, what they do is their fundamental difference in why they're suffering the least amount of breaches. They do the technology piece, they do the risk piece, but they are also heavily involved in training their people and getting involved in various workshops and ensuring that they're up to date as much as possible. So a very big difference between these organizations. And these are all interrelated. So when we think about moving more towards digital transformation, and whether you're talking about it in terms of different modes, or whether you're talking about it in terms of different platforms or what have you, the fundamental connection point here between doing the right things from a risk standpoint and starting to map out where's my data, what's the sensitivity of that data, what's my application stack look like, what's the application inventory, being able to map that out relates back to me being successful as an organization, not just from a security standpoint, but from the other things that we'll be talking about today as well. So they're really two sides of the same coin. And definitely something we need to look at in Canada as we see a significant increase in the amount of data that we're all storing within the organization. It's impressive just the amount that we all save now, especially as the cost of storage has dropped dramatically. But what we find is that the tool sets that we use are not the tool sets that we necessarily should be using. And so when I go out and we look at organizations and what kind of tools that they're using, we still see a lot of the similar types of tools that we've seen for quite a while. And there's a lot of opportunity for us to be able to do things differently than we have been in the past. And so when we measure how many Canadian organizations are involved with DevOps, we've got about a third of organizations say, yeah, I'm kind of there. I'm thinking about it. And we've got, in terms of microservices and in terms of containers, we've got about a quarter to 1/5 of organizations who are going down that path. If we want to be able to do the things that companies like Landar are doing, or even companies who are just doing things a little bit better, we've got a lot of really good examples from across Canada of companies and governments just doing things a little bit better than they've done, then those are going to be key for us to be able to not just get the scalability that we're going to need, but also to de-risk as we start to launch new applications. And as we start to connect those applications into new and more meaningful ways. So for example, whether it's I want to plug in a geographic information system, or I want to plug in an e-commerce component to this, or some social aspect, or what have you. My ability to do that as I start to move towards more of an API-exposed microservice type of architecture is going to be much easier than when I have my traditional monolithic code base that hasn't been divided up into that componentized type of architecture. And it's much more easy when we think about back in the day when we tried to do this from a service-oriented architecture standpoint, and we had web service description language and simple object access protocol and all the different protocols we're trying to use to connect applications. It's radically different today than it was a decade ago from a SOA standpoint. So things have vastly improved. So I've been talking about how we need to do things more quickly and we need to have a little bit more urgency. I am happy to say, though, that charts like this, make you kind of happy to be in Canada when you see the fact that we've got a lot of good growth in our use of things like Ansible, our use of Docker, and our use of a range of different technologies. Docker, of course, being one of different kinds of containers that are out there. They're not the only one, of course. But just seeing that movement towards architectures and towards the tool base that starts to make us say, okay, we are moving in the right direction. So that's a good thing that we're doing. So I want to start to bring all these pieces together and give you a flavor for when we're looking at those organizations who are the experimentalists and they're trying to move over to become the operationalists. What are some of the key things that they need to be looking at? Well, one is understanding about citizen developers and the role of the changing role of the developer and the expanding role, and how many more organizations today are involved in some degree of development than ever have been in the past, and that the usage of those tools continues to get easier and easier. Actually, there's a friend of mine who set up a fun little service. Basically, the idea was, him and his wife, they love to shop, and they also love to cook. And they love cool recipes, and so he set up this little website where they get to pick the meals of the week, and that'll automatically spray out what the ingredients are that they need to pick up in the grocery store, and then it'll automatically give them the optimal path through the grocery store to pick up those specific ingredients, and then they can make those meals throughout the week. And actually, he said, hey, come over for dinner. I said, oh, okay, cool. And he sent me the link to his website that he had built himself. He goes, just pick what you want. And says, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. You had about 50 or 60 different items. I could pick that. And automatically on the back end, it would tell him all the ingredients and what they needed to shop for. But he set that up himself, and it was pretty straightforward for him to do, and he's showing me how he did that. But anyway, so the role of the developer becoming much easier with the tool sets that we've got available, and way more powerful than we've seen in the past. It's incredible what we can do from embedding machine learning in what we're doing, or elements of blockchain or what have you in what we're doing that have been far more difficult to do in the past, and those tools get easier and easier to use. Again, looking at things from the architecture of the future, we've been talking about componentized applications for many, many years now, at least a decade and a half, in moving towards that direction. Now we're at a point where the blueprints for doing that are much more refined. The tools are much more refined than they ever have been as well. So things are far easier to do. And we've got many good case studies and examples of how to do that really well. And you're going to be hearing more about that from the Red Hat folk throughout the day, which is great. Function as a service. So a lot of what we need to do when we're talking about automation is really talking about abstracting the things that we do at a business process layer or what we do in an application layer from what's happening in an underlying infrastructure. And so all function as a service it's just a forward-looking version of that, where if an event gets fired off an IoT device, as an example, that event, I get billed only for the computation that was done on that event, and so that happens at a 10 millisecond level, and I get billed at that, as opposed to being billed for spinning up and spinning down an entire server. So again, that's the direction that our marketplace is going in, and the more that we embrace these kind of tools, the faster we're going to be able to take advantage of things like that. And then DevOps, of course, is about the tools that we use, and you're going to hear a lot more about those tools. And Red Hat, by the way, is also very good about talking about the processes behind that. And one of the key processes that you've heard a little bit about around the change management side of things is a key process to being able to do things differently. If you haven't read the Phoenix Project and the follow-up book to that, well worth the read. If you have read it, I've reread it, and it's great. Definitely when you're talking about work in process and trying to accelerate that work in process, and trying to ensure that when I'm deploying code, that I'm deploying it in a way that's not going to break other things within that production environment, it's really good to be able to have a better grounding of that process and the application of that process. And that's what I think the Phoenix Project, Gene Kim's book, and then the follow-up to that are really good about doing, is describing, okay, well, how do I start to embed that process? Open APIs are going to be key for this architecture moving forward. Again, being able to connect different components that we haven't created. And it's not just about getting the functionality of that application, but it's about being able to get the data that's tied to that application. So when we talk about things like machine learning, it's not just I stand up a Hadoop cluster on-prem or Spark or what have you, but it's about being able to get access to data that I wouldn't otherwise have. I want to draw a geofence around Quebec City, and I want to be able to say, okay, why is my product doing well in this area or not? Or I want to measure road safety, and I want to say, okay, well, in this certain area, how is it doing? How is it progressing? If we enact given legislation in the province of Quebec, what would be the impact in terms of road safety or whatever that might be? So there's all sorts of things that can be done, but we don't have that data necessarily on-prem. The more that we start to move off and embed this within what we're doing from an open API perspective is going to help us. And then when we talk about machine learning, what a vastly different space it is today than it was yesterday and what it'll be tomorrow. We've got lots of great examples throughout Canada of organizations embedding ML into what they're doing. It's getting easier and easier. The role of the data scientist is still an important role, but is diminishing as the tool sets become much easier to use. And so I'd encourage you to continue to look down that path. Happy to chat with you more about that in more detail. And then IoT, everywhere we're going to see more and more sensors, whether it's on our person, whether it's throughout our organizations, whether it's a small business and they're using it to adjust their heating, or whether it's big government and it's using it to be able to analyze what's happening from traffic patterns to transportation to whatever that might look like. But IoT is then being combined with other things. One of the examples that we start to see a lot more of, in particular from the Hyperledger folk, but also from the Ethereum folk, is being able to combine it with distributed ledger in order to be able to track the provenance of food, so that I can be assured that the item that I've purchased or that's sitting on my plate has been refrigerated properly, and all the other things have been done properly to that food, and it's organic in the way that I believe it should be. But again, there's lots of benefit coming from the combination of things like IoT plus machine learning plus blockchain. It's not just one in isolation to the other. And I think it's important too you're going to be hearing a lot more about the different open source technologies that are out there, but is to acknowledge the fact that it's from an open source standpoint that the web itself exists, and that big data now exists, and that mobility, et cetera, fundamentally has been driven forward from an open source standpoint. It's really interesting just to see how many of the projects from open source have pioneered and pushed that forward. So it's important from a governmental standpoint to continue to support that drive to openness. So if I'm going to bring it all together into one place, in the upper left-hand component, what we're looking to do is to abstract what we're doing from a developer standpoint, from an admin standpoint, or what have you, from the underlying infrastructure as much as possible. And we do that through automation. We do that through the processes that we're going to be looking at. And then in the bottom left, what we're trying to do is to work with developers to allow for continuous development, to allow for development in ways that allow that team to be able to work more like a product team rather than a project team, so that the team that writes the code also runs the code. And so when something bad happens at 3 in the morning, that they're the same folk that actually have to deal with that issue. But the fact is that they can do that because we've implemented the right process and the right tools for them to actually be able to carry that out. And then it's being able to, in the upper right, look at things like integration. There's still work that needs to be done from an identity standpoint, from an integration standpoint, that the organization is going to need to do. I'm not saying that there's not some heavy lifting and some work involved in terms of being able to bring these pieces together still. But certainly that's areas to be looking at as well. The benefit to doing that, though, is that we get to then bring in these other components, as I've been talking about in terms of IoT, blockchain, and that kind of thing. And why I mentioned that platform as a service, in particular in Canada, is going to be very important for us, again, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, because it's going to give us that capability to be able to easily bind to these different types of services that otherwise we wouldn't be able to have access to. So we asked organizations, this chart kind of fell apart a little bit when we started to compress it in terms of size, but essentially what it's saying is that organizations, we asked them about just one simple element of all the things I've been talking about. We asked them about big data and said, is your infrastructure ready for big data? And what Canadian organizations said was, no, it's not ready. And we said, well, why is that the case? And they said, well, it's not really scalable. I can't really get the performance that I need. And so what we need to help organizations do is to move forward from that point, but at least first acknowledge, okay, where are the challenges that I have? And if that challenge is in that environment, either A, I've got to upgrade that traditional environment, or B, again, there's IaaS and PaaS type solutions that can help offload that. So I've been talking about examples that I think are kind of top down, right? So thinking about the business problem or the problem from a governmental standpoint all the way down to the technological component. But we can also think about it from the bottom up type of approach. So we think about the earlier problem that we were identifying, which is IT helping the business side of the organization be able to identify which aspect of the organization can be improved, be able to help which technologies, and then be able to project manage it. Trying to find that time to be able to do this is going to be a challenge. So the more we can start to think about what individuals do or what teams do on a given day, throughout a given week, is important, because what we can start to do is say, okay, well, maybe those tasks that normally take me Monday to Friday, maybe there's ways I could do that to Monday to Friday morning or something like that. And the way to be able to start to do that is to invest in the things that we've been talking about that you're going to hear Red Hat continue to talk about, which is investing in the right tools, investing in the right processes, looking at things like, unplanned time and reducing unplanned work that happens within the organization. How do we do that? By implementing the processes that also we've been talking a little bit about today. So starting to do those things that we see on the right-hand side of that chart in order to be able to shorten that week just a little bit so that the time we've invested in the basics of keeping the lights on is reduced a little bit, and when we can then start to transfer that over into the innovative side of things. So 3 points I want to close off on is, number one is, one of the things that we see in Canada is our willingness to fail is not quite like south of the border. I think the more that we're comfortable with just trying things out and experimenting, and if it doesn't quite work that first time, that we're learning and we're going to do things better the next time. Is that failing fast, I think, is a really important ideology and philosophy for us to pick up on, but it has practical implications for our organization. It's thinking about that architecture of the future from a hybrid fashion, right, from on-prem through the cloud, through to the sensors or whatever I might have at the edge of that network. But it's also thinking about it from the bottom of the stack to the top of the stack and how I can do things differently there as well. And then we want to work the plan. So the more we can do planning, just like from a security standpoint, the risk planning, remember that was a differentiator from leading Canadian organizations who are more successful from a security standpoint, that and training. Similarly, the more we can make, whether it's an 18-month plan or whatever that plan looks like, but is to plan forward and say, okay, well, here's where I'm at today. Here's how I'm going to deploy this. Because we don't become an operationalist overnight. We don't become an experimentalist necessarily overnight either. So we've got to have a good plan in place. And again, we can talk about what that looks like certainly over the breaks and over lunch and over, I think we've got some cocktails at the end of the day as well. It's interesting though. So all these things that we can measure and all these things that we look at from, from a technology shift standpoint, at the end of the day, what we found too, one of the big differences between Canadian organizations that are more successful and those who are less is involvement in community. Right? So when we see organizations getting out, being involved in workshops, getting involved with events like this, makes a very big difference in terms of those successes. And why is that? Well, I guess it's pretty obvious. It's because they're learning from their peers, they're sharing best practices, they're learning from the failures and successes of those peers as well. So one of the big differences, kind of a warm and fuzzy type of thing, but actually makes a big difference in terms of the success that we're seeing across organizations. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here, and I thank Red Hat for the invitation to be able to speak with you today. And again, I look forward to the conversation throughout the day with you as well as we continue to do that. So thank you very much. Thank you.